My name is Emily Carter. 10 years ago, on a cold December night, I met a boy who had nothing. No home. No family beside him. No warm coat. And as far as I knew, no one in the world who was coming to look for him. I was driving home that night after a long day at work. It was almost 9 in the evening, and the streets were nearly empty. The wind was strong, and the temperature had dropped below freezing. I remember thinking about nothing except getting home, making some tea, and getting into bed. Then I saw him. He was sitting alone on a bench outside a small grocery store. He looked about 10 or 11 years old. His clothes were thin, his shoes were worn out, and he kept rubbing his hands together because they were so cold. People walked past him. Some looked at him. Most didn't. I almost drove past him too. But something made me stop. I pulled my car over and looked at him through the windshield. For a few seconds, I just sat there. Then I got out. I walked toward him and said, "Hey, are you okay?" The boy looked up at me. He didn't answer. He just stared at me with tired eyes. I noticed his lips were trembling. I took off my coat. "Here, put this on." He immediately shook his head. "No, ma'am. It's okay. I can't take it." I smiled. "You can." He looked at the coat, then back at me. Why? That question stayed with me. Why? Because he was cold. Because I had a coat and he didn't. Because sometimes helping someone doesn't need a big reason. I handed it to him again. "Just take it." This time, he slowly reached out. He put the coat around his shoulders. It was too big for him. He pulled it tightly around his body and looked down. For the first time, I saw a small smile on his face. "Thank you," he whispered. I sat down beside him. "What are you doing out here alone?" He looked toward the road. "My name is Daniel." "Nice to meet you, Daniel." He nodded. Then he said something that broke my heart. "I was waiting for my dad." I looked at him. "Where is he?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He stared at his shoes. "He said he'd come back." "When?" "Yesterday." I didn't know what to say. I asked him if he had somewhere to stay. He shook his head. I asked if there was another family member I could call. Again, he shook his head. Then he quietly said, "My dad lost his job." He told me that things had been getting worse for months. They had moved from one place to another. His father had promised him they would find somewhere safe to stay. But that promise had slowly disappeared. That night, Daniel had been left waiting outside the grocery store. He still believed his father would return. He was just a child. He didn't understand that sometimes adults make promises they can't keep. I looked at the boy sitting beside me. He was trying very hard not to cry. I said, "Daniel, you can't stay here tonight." He looked nervous. "I won't cause trouble." "I know. I can sleep outside." "No." I stood up. "Come with me." He looked at me like he wasn't sure he had heard me correctly. "Where?" "I'm going to get you somewhere warm." Daniel didn't move. Then he asked, "Are you going to call the police?" I told him the truth. "I don't know what happens next. But I know you're not staying outside in this weather." He finally stood up. I drove him to a nearby family shelter. Before we went inside, I gave him my phone number. I didn't know why. Maybe I just wanted him to know that someone cared. Daniel looked at the number written on the piece of paper. Then he looked at me. "Will I see you again?" I smiled. "I hope so." He gave me a small nod. Then he walked inside. I stood outside for a moment. The wind was still blowing. I was wearing only a thin sweater because I had given him my coat. But somehow, I didn't feel cold anymore. I got into my car and drove home. I thought about Daniel all night. I wondered where his father was. I wondered what would happen to him. And most of all, I wondered if I would ever see that little boy again. I didn't know it then. But 10 years later, Daniel would come looking for me. And when he finally stood at my front door, I almost didn't recognize him. But he remembered me. He remembered my name. He remembered that cold December night. And he had spent 10 years trying to find me. Not because he needed anything from me, but because he wanted to give me something I never expected. A thank you. 10 years had passed since that cold December night. Life had changed for both of us, but in very different ways. For Daniel, those years became a long journey. For me, they became a lesson in how quickly life can change. After that night, I never saw Daniel again. I called the shelter a few days later. They told me he had been moved to another place. His father had been found, but things were complicated. Daniel was eventually placed with a foster family. I asked if I could leave my number. They said they would pass it along. But I never received a call. At first, I thought about him often. Then life became busy. I got married. I moved to a small house outside the city. I changed jobs. And slowly, that little boy became a memory. A very special memory. But still a memory. Then, about 6 years later, my husband and I separated. It wasn't one big fight. There wasn't one terrible moment. We simply became two people going in different directions. After the divorce, I had to start over. I was 41 years old. I had a small house, a lot of bills, and a job that barely covered everything. I worked at a local office during the day. In the evenings, I sometimes worked extra hours. There were months when I had to choose which bills could wait. I stopped buying things for myself. I stopped going out with friends. Even small things started feeling expensive. But I kept telling myself, things will get better. Some days I believed it. Other days, I didn't. One rainy Tuesday morning, I woke up and noticed water dripping from the ceiling. The roof had finally given up. I stood in my kitchen with a bucket in my hands, listening to the rain outside. I laughed to myself. Not because anything was funny. Sometimes you laugh because crying won't solve the problem either. That morning, I was late for work. My car had also started making a strange noise. I knew it needed repairs. I just didn't have the money. So I drove to work slowly and hoped it would make it through another week. That evening, I stopped at a small grocery store. I bought bread, milk, eggs, and a few other things. While I was standing in line, I saw a young man outside through the window. He was standing beside a black car. He looked like he was waiting for someone. I didn't pay much attention. I paid for my groceries and walked outside. As I reached my car, I noticed the young man was looking at me. He smiled. I gave him a polite smile back. Then he said, "Emily." I stopped. I hadn't heard my first name from a stranger in a long time. Yes. He walked a little closer. For some reason, his face looked familiar. But I couldn't place him. He was tall now. He was wearing a dark jacket and a simple watch. He looked confident. Nothing like the frightened little boy I remembered. He smiled again. "You probably don't remember me." I looked at him carefully. "I'm sorry." He reached into his pocket. Then he pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. My heart skipped. I recognized the handwriting. Not because I had seen it recently. Because I had seen it 10 years ago. On that cold December night. Daniel. I stared at him. Daniel. His smile grew wider. Yes. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I looked at the man standing in front of me. Then I looked at the old piece of paper in his hand. The number I had written for him 10 years earlier was still there. Faded. Folded. Almost falling apart. "You kept that." He nodded. "For 10 years. I didn't know what to say." He looked at me and said, "I've been trying to find you." "Why?" He smiled. "Because I never forgot what you did for me." I shook my head. "Daniel, it was just a coat." He laughed softly. "No, Emily. It wasn't just a coat. Then he looked toward my old car. His expression changed. Is that your car? I nodded. Yeah. Does it still work? Most days. He laughed. I laughed too. For the first time in a long time, I felt completely relaxed. Then Daniel said, I have something for you. I thought he meant a gift. Maybe flowers. Maybe something small. I wasn't expecting anything important. But then he walked toward his car and opened the trunk. He took out a large envelope. He walked back and handed it to me. I looked at him. What is this? Open it. I slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a letter. And beneath the letter was something else. A photograph. It was a picture of Daniel from years ago. He was standing outside the shelter. And he was wearing my coat. The same coat I had given him that night. I stared at the picture. Then I looked at Daniel. Why did you keep this? He took a breath. Because that night changed my life. He told me that after I left, he spent several years moving between foster homes. Some were good. Some were difficult. But he never forgot the woman who had stopped when everyone else kept walking. He said that whenever things became difficult, he remembered something I had told him. Sometimes helping someone doesn't need a big reason. Those words had stayed with him. He finished school. He worked after school. He went to college with financial help from a scholarship. And slowly, his life began to change. Today, he owned a small technology company. He had employees. He had a home. He had built a life he once thought was impossible. Then he said something that made me completely silent. I didn't come here because I needed your help. He looked at me. I came because I wanted to help you. I smiled nervously. Daniel, I'm fine. He looked at my car again. Then at the grocery bags in my hands. Then he said, you don't have to pretend with me. I didn't know how he knew. But somehow, he did. I looked down. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to admit something. I wasn't fine. I was tired. I was struggling. And I had become very good at hiding it. Daniel reached into his pocket. He took out another small envelope. This is for you. I didn't open it. I couldn't. What is it? He smiled. Something I promised myself 10 years ago. I looked at him. What did you promise? He answered quietly. That one day, if I ever became successful, I would find the woman who gave me her coat. And I would make sure she knew that her kindness had not been forgotten. I felt tears in my eyes. But Daniel wasn't finished. He looked at me and said, Emily, I need you to come somewhere with me tomorrow. Where? He smiled. You'll see. And before I could ask another question, he walked back to his car. I stood there in the parking lot, holding that envelope. I had no idea where he was taking me. And I had no idea that the next morning, I would finally understand why Daniel had spent 10 years looking for me. The next morning, I almost decided not to go. I had spent half the night thinking about Daniel. I kept asking myself the same question. Why would someone who had become successful care so much about me? I hadn't done anything special. I had simply given a cold child my coat. That was all. At least, that's what I believed. At 9 in the morning, I heard a car stop outside my house. I looked through the window. It was Daniel. I grabbed my purse and walked outside. Good morning, he said with a smile. Good morning. He opened the passenger door for me. As I got inside, I noticed a small box sitting on the seat. I looked at him. What's that? You'll find out later. I smiled. You've become very mysterious. He laughed. Maybe. We drove for about 30 minutes. I noticed we were heading toward the older part of the city. The buildings became smaller. The streets looked familiar. Then Daniel turned onto a street I hadn't visited in years. I looked out the window. There was a small building at the end of the street. A sign stood in front of it. I read the words slowly. Daniel's Hope Center. I turned toward him. What is this? He parked the car. This is the reason I asked you to come. We walked inside. The building was warm and bright. There were children sitting at tables. Some were doing homework. Others were reading books. A few were eating breakfast. I looked around. What is this place? Daniel smiled. It's a center for kids who don't have a safe place to go after school. I looked at him. You built this. He nodded. I opened it 2 years ago. He told me that after becoming successful, he wanted to do something meaningful with his money. He remembered being that little boy sitting alone on a bench. He remembered being cold. He remembered being afraid. And he remembered how one person had stopped. So I wanted to build a place where kids like me could find someone who would stop. I looked around the room. There were pictures on the walls. Children smiling. Families standing together. Teachers helping students. Then I noticed something hanging near the entrance. A brown coat. My coat. The same one I had given Daniel 10 years earlier. I walked toward it. I couldn't believe it. You still have it. Daniel stood beside me. I couldn't throw it away. I touched the sleeve. It looked old now. The color had faded. But it was still the same coat. Why did you put it here? He looked at me. Because I want every kid who walks through that door to know something. What? Someone can change your life with one small act. I looked at him. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he handed me the small box from his car. Now you can open this. I slowly opened it. Inside was a simple silver key. I looked at him in confusion. What is this? The center has a small office that has been empty. He pointed toward a hallway. I want you to use it. I laughed. Daniel, I don't understand. You told me 10 years ago that helping someone doesn't need a big reason. He paused. I've remembered those words all these years. Then he said, I want you to help me here. I stared at him. Me? Yes. I don't know anything about running a place like this. You don't need to. He smiled. You just need to be the person who stops. I felt tears in my eyes. Daniel continued. I know what it's like to be that kid. He looked around the room. And I know there are still kids who feel the same way. I looked at the children sitting nearby. One little girl was quietly reading a book. A boy was drawing at a table. They looked safe. They looked happy. And suddenly, I understood. Daniel hadn't brought me here to give me money. He hadn't brought me here to make me feel sorry for myself. He had brought me here because he wanted to give me something much more important. A purpose. I looked at the key in my hand. Why me? Daniel smiled. Because 10 years ago, when everyone else walked past me, you stopped. I couldn't hold back my tears anymore. Daniel gave me a small envelope. This is the last thing. I opened it. Inside was a photograph. It was the same picture I had seen the day before. Daniel wearing my coat. But there was something written on the back. I turned it over. There were only a few words. Words he had written as a child. I read them slowly. I will never forget her. I looked up at Daniel. He was smiling. Then he said, You saved me that night. I shook my head. No, Daniel. You saved yourself. He smiled. Maybe. Then he looked at the children. But you showed me that someone could care. And that was when I realized something. Sometimes we think the little things we do disappear. We think people forget. We think our kindness was too small to matter. But sometimes, a single moment becomes a memory someone carries for the rest of their life. I had forgotten that cold December night. Daniel never did. And now, 10 years later, He had returned that kindness in a way I could never have imagined. But there was still one thing I didn't know. There was a reason Daniel had kept searching for me for so many years. And the next thing he told me made me understand just how much that night had truly meant to him. I looked at Daniel. What haven't you told me? He sat down in one of the chairs near the window. For the first time since I had seen him again, he looked nervous. There is something about that night, he said. I sat across from him. What is it? Daniel looked down at his hands. After you left me at the shelter, my father came back. I was surprised. He did. Daniel nodded. He came back early the next morning. I didn't know what to say. Where had he been? Daniel took a slow breath. He had been looking for work. He was ashamed that he couldn't provide for us. He thought he could fix everything before I found out how bad things had become. He looked toward the old coat hanging on the wall. But when he came back, he saw me wearing your coat. Daniel smiled sadly. I told him about you. What did he say? He asked me what your name was. I smiled. Did you tell him? I did. Daniel paused. Then my father said something I never forgot. What? He said, never forget people who help you when you have nothing to give them back. I looked down. Those words were simple, but somehow they explained everything. Daniel continued. My father tried to rebuild our life. He found work again. Things slowly became better. Then why did you go into foster care? Daniel looked at me. My father became sick. I stayed quiet. He passed away a few years later. I'm sorry. Daniel nodded. It was hard. He looked around the room. But I remembered what he told me. He reached into his wallet and pulled out an old photograph. It was a picture of his father. On the back was a handwritten note. Daniel handed it to me. I read it. It said that his father was proud of him and hoped he would never forget the people who had shown him kindness. Daniel took the photograph back. That became my promise. What promise? That if I ever had the chance, I would become that person for someone else. I looked around the center. Suddenly, everything made sense. The children. The books. The warm meals. The small rooms. The people helping them. This wasn't just a building. It was Daniel keeping a promise. A promise he had made long before he had money. Long before he had a company. Long before anyone knew his name. I asked him, how did you even find me? He smiled. That wasn't easy. He told me he spent years trying to locate me. The shelter had old records, but they couldn't give him much information. He remembered my first name. He remembered the city. And he remembered the company name written on a paper in my car that night. It took him years to connect the pieces. Finally, he found me. But he didn't contact me immediately. Why not? Because I wanted to make sure I could come back with something more than a thank you. I looked at him. What do you mean? I wanted to be able to say that I was okay. That sentence hit me harder than anything else. Daniel didn't want me to feel responsible for what happened to him. He wanted me to know that he had made it. That the little boy on the bench had grown up. That he had built a life. That he was safe. I smiled. You don't owe me anything. I know. He smiled back. That's why I wanted to do it. We both laughed. For a few seconds, it felt like the 10 years between us had disappeared. Before I left that day, Daniel walked me to the entrance. He handed me the key again. You really want me to work here? I really do. I looked at the building. Then at him. I'll try. He smiled. That's all I hoped for. I started walking toward the door. Then I stopped. Daniel. Yes. Thank you. He laughed. I'm the one who should be saying that. I shook my head. No. I looked at him. Thank you for reminding me that my life can still matter to someone. He didn't say anything. He just smiled. That afternoon, I went home and looked at my old house differently. The leaking roof was still there. The bills were still on the table. My car still needed repairs. Nothing had magically disappeared. But something inside me had changed. For years, I had believed my life was getting smaller. I had stopped making plans. Stopped expecting good things. Stopped believing I could make a difference. But Daniel reminded me of something I had forgotten. Sometimes your life doesn't need to become bigger. Sometimes it just needs to become meaningful. A week later, I started working at the center. At first, I helped the children with homework. Then I started organizing meals. I helped with school supplies. I listened when a child needed someone to talk to. And every evening before I went home, I looked at the old brown coat hanging near the entrance. It reminded me of a cold night 10 years earlier. A night I thought was long forgotten. But it wasn't forgotten. Not by Daniel. Not by his father. And not by the children whose lives were now being changed because of that one small act of kindness. A few months later, something unexpected happened. A little boy came into the center. He looked scared. He didn't talk much. He sat alone in the corner while the other children played. I walked over and sat beside him. "What's your name?" He looked at me. "My name is Noah." I smiled. "Nice to meet you, Noah." He looked at the coat hanging on the wall. Then he looked back at me. "Why is that coat there?" I smiled. "That's a long story." He waited. So I told him. Not every detail. Just enough. I told him about a cold night. A lonely boy. And a woman who decided to stop. When I finished, Noah looked at me and asked, "Did the boy become okay?" I smiled. "Yes." He asked, "How do you know?" I looked toward the office. Daniel was standing there, watching us. I smiled. Because he came back. And that was the moment I finally understood. The coat was never really the important part. The important part was that someone had stopped. And because one person stopped, another person learned to stop. Then another. And another. Maybe that's how kindness really works. It doesn't end with the person you help. Sometimes. It keeps moving. Long after you think the moment is over. And sometimes, 10 years later, it comes back to your door.